Now I'm going to turn your attention to export tariffs. I'm going to show the small country and large country analysis here on the same board. Just going to focus on the domestic market, and we're going to just focus on the internal domestic analysis. So price, quantity, right? We'll draw our supply and demand curves here. So let's say initially we've got a world price that's here. And here's our world price. Here is our quantity demanded and our quantity supplied. Now, what will an export tariff do? Okay? An export tariff is going to actually lower, right? If you think about it, so for a small country, we're dealing with an initial, just a world price. It's horizontal, right? Import demand curve. Price won't change. So I'm actually going to label this PW minus the tariff. Give me a little bit more room to work with here. Okay. And the initial price, then I'll put up here. Just a little bit more space so you guys can see this better. Okay. So here is QD0, QS0. These ones here are going to be our new quantities, okay? So initially, we're dealing with this world price. Okay. Now, what happens if you have the tariff in place? So the tariff, as far as the domestic, the producers are concerned, is when they go to export, of course, they're going to end up getting less than the world. They'll receive the world price, but they have to net out the tariff. So then what actually happens from their perspective? So in this case, what we're going to see is a change, right, in our surpluses. So how do we want to think about this one? Okay. So what's going to happen for the small country case? Well, one simple way to think about this is to imagine, well, what's going to happen to the, right, from their perspective? Well, if we end up lowering the price domestically, then they're going to end up gaining. Okay? And so we could say label this area here A. Okay? And then we're also going to want to think about what's going to happen in terms of these other losses, right? And in fact, actually, I'm going to label A, this whole thing here. So that's going to be A. Okay, so instead of just this rectangle, everything here to the left of the demand curve is A. All right, so now they're going to gain A. What about our sellers, though, in this case? Okay, our producers, what are they? What's happening for them? Okay, so I'm going to label this triangle in here B, this rectangle in here C, and then this triangle D. Okay. Remember now, what we're looking at is they're losing producer surplus because while they can continue to sell at the world price of PW, anytime they go to sell, they're actually going to only get to keep PW minus T. Okay? And just like you had with the export subsidy, you can imagine that in order to keep the domestic, what they get for selling at the same domestically at the same for what they receive for exporting, you could put a tax in place domestically to make sure that the domestic price is also PW minus T, which is how you're going to also affect consumer surplus. Otherwise, what would happen, right? Without putting that second policy in place, these guys have no incentive to export. They're only going to want to produce domestically, okay? Which is kind of why this is, in general, somewhat of a bizarre trade policy to have. What might actually make a government put a policy like this into place? Well, they could argue that, perhaps this is some kind of strategic industry and they don't want you exporting, I don't know, some rare metals or minerals or something to that effect. Of course, if that's the case, they could also just put a ban on any kinds of exports. So in terms of comparing this policy to the others, you don't see this nearly as frequently as you see kind of our more standard things like export subsidies or production subsidies in particular, and import tariffs. Nonetheless, you might see this happening from time to time. So what's going on for our producers in this case? So they're going to end up losing A, B, C, and D. Okay. And in this case now, though, what is the government getting out of this? Well, so now in this case, right, we're going back to this notion of a tariff, right? So unlike the subsidy cases where the government was paying money to put the program in place, they are receiving tariff revenue. And they're receiving it because it's an export tariff just over the quantity that's being exported with the tariff in place. So the government is gaining area C. So our net, right, the consumers gain A, but they're doing it at the expense of the producers. The government revenue, that area C, is also coming at the expense of the producers. So in the end, we are once again left with our two distortions. Except I do want to highlight for you, because up till now, whenever we've drawn our distortions, notice they've always been the lower triangles. And so don't get confused and think that D, the distortion, is down here, right? You always want to look at the direction in which the quantity is moving. Right? Our quantity supplied goes from QS0 to QS1. So that means the direction is going to be, looking there above in this case, right? The supply curve. So here's our distortion here. And likewise, we end up consuming too much, more than we should at given world prices. And so we end up with that consumption distortion, okay? So we end up with these distortions here. But again, analogous to the analyses we've done up to this point, we end up with a deadweight loss that's a result of a consumption distortion and a production distortion. Again, right, the unifying theme in any of these analyses that we do is to always look for how the quantities change from the optimal quantities. So that's the small country case. Well, what about in a large country case? Well, again, the difference, what we need to do when we're comparing the two, is think about what's happening to world prices. Now, in the small country case, nothing happens to world prices. Now here, we are in fact going to see downward pressure on world prices. Right? So here is our domestic supply and demand. I'm going to go ahead and have our initial world price here. So here's QD0, QS0. Now in this case, what's going to happen when we go to put the tariff in place? Okay. So with the tariff, we have to think about what is actually going to happen to the world price. So again, what's going to happen if you put an export tariff in place? That's going to decrease export supply. I would shift the export supply curve in. You can imagine that if you're shifting that supply curve inward, what's actually going to happen is that the world price is going to go up. Now, you'd see the world price go up to, say, PW star. Okay. But from the domestic Right? From the home country's perspective, what matters isn't just the world price. What's going to matter is the world price minus the tariff. Right? And you would get where these prices should actually go from the world market. As I said, I'm just going to focus on, right, on the home country graph here. So in this case, what do we actually see happening? Okay. So now we're going to see that with this export tariff in place, that reduction in export supply coming out of the home country is going to end up putting upward pressure on the world price, so that when we net out the tariff, the domestic price falls, but not by as much as it would in the small country case where the world price stays the same. So now we can look here. We've got our new quantity demanded and our new quantity supplied. So what's happening in this case? So again, if we track our changes in surplus, okay, I'm going to put this one right over here. Right, so in green, we're going to have the large country case. What happens to our consumer surplus? Well, again, we're looking for the decrease in our price. So again, we'll have this area A here. Right? So consumers are gaining A. And again, our producers, if you think about what's happening, so we've got this B, C, and D again, just as we did before. We're actually also going to track an additional area here. So, but from the producer's perspective, again, they're going to lose A, B, C, and D. The difference here comes in the government revenue. Now remember that the tariff is given by that vertical distance, right? So the tariff revenue is actually this whole rectangle here. This is labeled the upper part of that rectangle E. So the tariff revenue is C plus E. So now when we're looking through all the changes, while that gain in consumer surplus, again, is at the expense of the producers, C, and it's tariff revenue at the expense of the producers, but that part of the tariff revenue E is not coming at the expense of anyone in the home country. Right, so the net effect doesn't have to be negative. It's going to depend on the size of this E, which is now the terms of trade gain. Right, by restricting our exports through the use of the export tariff, we're actually putting upward pressure on world prices, causes the price of our export to go up, right, which is a terms of trade improvement, or an increase in the terms of trade, which remember is price of exports over price of imports. And so we can see here how this could actually be something now, right, in the large country case. Now we can start to see, well, maybe export tariffs could make some sense in terms of trying to generate, right, a welfare gain for the home country. But just as we had with our import tariffs for a large country, you need to remember that this terms of trade gain is a terms of trade loss for our trading partners. Okay? It's another one of those beggar thy neighbor policies. And so you have to think about what's the likely response going to be from our trade partners. So that concludes the analysis of these, analyzing these different kinds of production subsidies, tariffs, using supply and demand. One thing I want us to now, we're going to turn our attention to, is thinking about export subsidies in the context of a high-tech industry. And we're going to use this example of Boeing and Airbus. And in that case, what's going to set that apart from all of the analysis we've done up to this point is that we're no longer going to be talking about a world of competitive markets.